Edgar looked at his friend Paul with surprise. "Are you serious? Are you really going to marry a country girl? You have 2 university degrees. What about her? A high school diploma?" "Who cares?" smiled Paul. "It doesn't need diplomas to start a family. But my Molly is kind, hard-working and a very good cook. In general, I'm waiting for you at our wedding, and yes, the wedding will not be in a restaurant, but in her village. That's what Molly and I decided. She's got a lot of relatives, and I've hardly any. So we'll celebrate in the old-fashioned way, with tables laid out all over the street, songs and dancing. Will you come?" Edgar laughed. "I wouldn't miss this show for anything. You can count on me. I hope at least it doesn't involve a fight." "That depends," Paul laughed, and then told him when and where his country wedding would be happening. After 3 weeks later, Edgar, having brought a small gift and flowers, went to his friend's wedding. However, as soon as he was out of the city, his navigator went wrong, and Edgar wandered along the country roads and ended up in some village that did not even have a name. Edgar stopped, got out of the car, and looked around confused. The village lived its own life. People flashed here and there, but they were all far away, and Edgar simply did not have time to approach them to ask questions. Suddenly a young woman with a bucket of milk came out of one of the houses. She looked at the expensive car with surprise and smiled at Edgar, setting the bucket on the ground. "Hello? Are you looking for someone? Maybe I can help you." Edgar looked at the stranger with interest. She looked about 25 years old, maybe a little more, slim, statuesque, beautiful. She held herself lightly and at ease. Edgar's silence was somewhat prolonged, and he realized it when a woman raised a thin black eyebrow in puzzlement. "Yes, I'm sorry. I'm here for the wedding, and I think I got lost." He hastened to explain the situation and called out the name of the village he needed. "Ah, I see. You missed the country road that leads there. Now you have to go back to the big crossroads, and there you need to turn right. And in 2 kilometers, there will be the village you are looking for." "Thank you. May I ask what your name is?" asked Edgar, unable to just walk away from this lovely stranger. The young woman introduced herself as Alice, and then added that she would have gladly chatted with him some more, but that she had to rush to the farm to feed calves. "Do you work there as a milkmaid?" Edgar asked in surprise. "No, my mother is the milkmaid, and I just help her. All right, do you remember the way? I really should be going." And the woman easily picked up the full bucket and quickly walked out of sight. Following Alice's advice, Edgar quickly found the right road and soon found himself drawn into the merry bustle of the village wedding. Paul greeted his friend with a smile. "Well, are you ready for an adventure? Now we're all going off together to get the bride, only according to local tradition, we'll have to go into the houses we meet along the way, sort of like a groom looking for someone to marry." "I thought we were going in cars," Edgar wondered. "Drop your city manners," laughed Paul. "I promised you an unforgettable adventure, and there's no way we're getting behind the wheel, because we'll be served drinks in every house. To refuse them would be to offend the owners. I can't drink too much. After all, the groom is the main person at the wedding, after the bride, of course, so you'll have to take the rap for me." Yep, that's something Edgar certainly didn't expect. In fact, on the way to the bride's house, they had to look in every yard. And there was a little playful banter going on everywhere. Some people tried to match him to an elderly woman. Some offered a cow or a goat instead of the bride. A couple of houses chased them away with jokes and pranks. And everywhere they were offered shots of booze, which the groom's friends were obliged to drink. The crowd grew like a snowball, and when they reached the bride's house, there were about 50 of them. But the adventures of the groom and his friends did not end there. They still had to ransom the bride. Only then the merry crowd piled into the bride's house, and the groom was finally able to see his bride. Within an hour afterwards, the bride and groom became husband and wife. Their wedding lasted 2 days. The third, Edgar, like many other guests, slept it off, and then together with Paul and his young wife returned to the city. 2 months passed. Edgar's life returned to normal, and he remembered Paul's wedding with a smile, realizing that he would never have such an adventure again. His only regret was that he had missed the opportunity to get to know Alice better. The young woman had caught his eye for something. She was unlike anyone he had known before her. Edgar thought he had no luck at all in relationships with women, and he did not understand why. Young, promising, not poor, Edgar knew how to take care of the future and diligently saved money for a future without poverty, so that he had a family. He would do everything so that she would not need anything. Edgar never lent money to anyone and never borrowed money himself, sometimes denying himself certain desires, and he was very proud of the fact that he lived independently of anyone. Edgar was not very fond of modern girls, who reminded him of predators. He believed that they need only one thing, that he pampers them with gifts and provides a beautiful life. What Edgar needed was a normal family, a stay-at-home wife, and a couple of beautiful children that she would give him. She must be able to cook delicious food, adore cleanliness, take care of home comfort, do everything to make him want to come home. Of course, at the same time, she must also look beautiful. Recently in Edgar's dreams, Alice fitted this persona exactly. The unassuming daughter of a milkmaid who certainly knew how to do everything around the house and certainly cooks wonderfully. Alice, moreover, was beautiful, and this greatly inspired Edgar. Several times he was going to see her in the village, but he was stopped by the thought that perhaps she was married or had a boyfriend. It could not be that the men around her would miss out on such a beautiful woman. However, things did not allow him to do so at once, and then he considered that time had passed, and his visit would look strange, and soon he remembered Alice with regret. But one day something happened that turned Edgar's life upside down. One evening, on his way home from work, he almost had an accident. His car started sneezing and stalling at full throttle. The cars around him started honking frantically. One of them almost collided with his car. Edgar quickly switched on emergency lights and managed to park on the side of the road. After catching his breath and calming down a bit, he called a tow truck. When the car was sent for repair, Edgar decided to save on a cab and get home on foot, especially since he only had 2 blocks to walk. The closest way was through the park. Twilight fell on the city. Edgar walked quietly, thinking about how much it would cost him to repair his car. Suddenly, 3 dark figures loomed in front of him. "Hey, man, have you got a smoke?" asked one of the guys in a husky, chilly voice. "I don't smoke," Edgar answered with a challenge. "Well, give us some money for a packet of cigarettes then," grinned the other guy. "Why don't you guys go on your way? What do you need trouble for? I've been in the karate class since I was a kid, and I'm not accustomed to be ceremonious with my opponents," said Edgar, realizing that a fight was imminent. Without thinking twice, he struck first, but in a couple of minutes he was lying on the pavement with his hands covering his head. The hooligans kicked him like a soccer ball, and Edgar would have had a hard time if not for a woman suddenly appearing from nowhere and screaming, "Leave him alone, you rascals! I'll call the police!" But the threat of the woman did not embarrass the hooligans, and then she did not hesitate and rushed at them, waving her purse, calling for help along the way. Now the guys got cold feet and ran away, and the young woman leaned over to Edgar, asking him sympathetically about his well-being. He recognized her voice at once, and then, through the cloudy veil, he saw such a familiar face, for he had imagined it hundreds of times in his dreams. "Alice," he whispered with pursed lips, "do you remember me? A couple of months ago, I was on my way to a wedding. My name is Edgar." "Oh, I remembered you," Be patient. You need to go to the hospital right away. You probably have a concussion. Only if you come with me. I don't want to lose you again. Edgar wanted to rise, but Alice categorically forbade him to do so. All right, I'll go with you, especially since I won't relax until I know that you're all right. Already in the hospital, it turned out that Alice's assumptions were correct, and Edgar had to spend some time in the hospital. Alice often visited him, always bringing him something delicious and taking care of him. They talked a lot, and Edgar found out that she lived and worked in this city, and at the wedding day she just came to the village to visit her mother. Edgar didn't ask where she worked so as not to embarrass the woman. After all, he himself was a senior manager in a reputable company, and she might feel uncomfortable. He had long ago decided to himself that he would marry her and force her to quit where she worked now. After all, what could a girl from the countryside work as? A cashier, a janitor, a kindergarten teacher? What else could daughters of milkmaids do? None of this mattered. Edgar was interested in a different question, and he asked if Alice was married. She smiled. Do you really think that if I were a married woman, or at least just dating a guy, I would spend so much time with you? A delighted Edgar took Alice by the hand. A week later, he was discharged from the hospital and invited Alice to dinner at a restaurant. At first, he wanted to save money out of habit, but then he decided to impress Alice and chose the most prestigious place, which only the city's elite attended. Alice was clearly embarrassed by his choice. Don't be shy, Edgar asked smugly. I'll help you choose the dishes, or I can make the order myself. Yes, that would be better, Alice nodded. I understand. Edgar smiled at her. You're not used to places like this, but once in a lifetime you can afford to live a life of luxury. Of course, one wouldn't dream of that in the countryside. I don't think your mother, a milkmaid, told you about such fancy restaurants. Alice nodded, and Edgar grinned smugly. The waiter serving them looked at Alice with surprise, then turned his gaze to Edgar. There was something strange in his eyes, and Edgar thought he was struck by Alice's not very presentable appearance. She was wearing a plain dress and cheap shoes. Of course, thought Edgar, he wonders what a man like me could find in this simpleton. Stupid, he doesn't understand that such women can be the best wives. Alice was silent, looking around, and Edgar hurriedly ordered. The evening passed pleasantly enough, and Edgar, heated by the wine he had drunk, suggested that they should continue at his house. I don't think we know each other well enough for that, Alice smiled. She was clearly embarrassed by his suggestion. On the contrary, Edgar parried, I've gotten to know you very well in all the time we've been talking, and I think you're right for me. Don't let it embarrass you that I am well educated. After all, the man in the family is supposed to be the breadwinner, so you won't have to work. You will stay at home and raise our children. Really? Wondered Alice. You've got it all planned, haven't you? And what about me? Maybe you should ask me what I want too? Oh, come on. Well, what can a milkmaid's daughter dream of? A herd of cows? I'm sure it's every girl's dream to marry well, and I'm going to propose to you. Alice stretched out. What about romance? Flowers? A ring? Getting down on one knee, after all? Edgar wanted to say something, but at that moment the waiter brought the bill. Edgar took it with a patronizing gesture and glanced at the digits, but immediately cried out involuntarily. What? Are you out of your mind? Wouldn't that be a little much for one meal? You should understand that our restaurant is the best in the city, and the prices here are somewhat higher than in other places. And besides, you ordered expensive wine. Scammers! You should have warned me about this in advance. I'm not going to pay such fabulous sums. I'm not a millionaire. Get me the manager. I'll deal with him. I'm here, Alice said quietly. Edgar jumped up as if stung and turned to her. What? What did you say? I said, I work as the manager of this restaurant, which, by the way, belongs to my own uncle. My mother is his older sister. They lost their parents early and she raised him, helped him get an education. Then my uncle got married and settled in the city. He worked as a chef for a long time and now he's the owner of the restaurant himself. That's the kind of brother a simple milkmaid has. And I'm her daughter. Yes, Edgar, you met me in the village, and it immediately allowed you to put me far below yourself. And you didn't even think that I could have a decent education too. Ridiculous, isn't it? Still not believing his ears, Edgar looked at the waiter. He nodded, confirming Alice's words. I'm going to pay, Edgar muttered, barely moving his naughty lips. Don't bother. Alice waved her hand. Consider that the dinner was on me. Alice, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I hope this misunderstanding won't affect our relationship. She only smiled in response. Did we ever have a relationship? At one point I thought you were a nice guy, but I realized quickly that I was wrong. Anyway, goodbye, Edgar. I only let myself rest for a couple of hours, and now I have to get back to my duties. She went out. The waiter followed her. And Edgar sat down at the table and wrapped his arms around his head. He felt not just humiliated, but crushed and insulted. But was it all his fault? Why hadn't Alice confessed everything to him at once? Edgar looked at the cheque again, and the thought flashed through his mind that he should pay it after all. But his usual stinginess got the better of him again, and he just left the restaurant, promising himself to forget about everything. After all, there are plenty of girls around, and every one of them dreams of a groom like him. And one day he would find one who would admire him. He did not notice that Alice was standing by the window of the restaurant, looking at him mockingly. She knew for sure that a man like Edgar would never have real happiness. It always bypasses stingy and narrow-minded people, forcing them to live in loneliness. And maybe that was their happiness.